The Battle of the Atlantic was not merely a contest of ships, but a war defined by silence, distance, and the terrifying void known as the Mid-Atlantic Gap. Here, beyond the reach of Allied land-based aircraft, the German U-boat Wolfpacks hunted with impunity, turning the ocean into a graveyard of merchant tonnage. In 1942, desperation drove the British Admiralty to consider the impossible, a vessel so massive it could not be sunk, built from a material so abundant it covered the poles. It was to be a floating island of ice, a 2,000-foot aircraft carrier capable of withstanding torpedoes and waves alike. Project Habakkuk stands today not as a folly, but as a testament to the extremes of wartime ingenuity, a moment when the fear of defeat forced engineers to try and conquer nature itself. The void in the Atlantic Ocean, is a deception. From the air, it appears as a singular, unbroken expanse of gray water, indifferent to human endeavor. But in 1942, the ocean was not a wilderness. It was a carefully plotted grid of survival. For Great Britain, the sea lanes were the arteries of the nation. Food, oil, ammunition, and men flowed from the Americas to the British Isles, a lifeline maintained by the slow, heaving progress of the merchant convoys. Without this transit, the war would be lost not on the beaches of Normandy, but in the bread lines of London and the fuel-starved airfields of Kent. By the spring of that year, however, the lifeline was fraying. The German U-boat arm, commanded by Admiral Karl Dönitz, had refined its tactics into a ruthlessly efficient industrial process. They did not seek to win battles. They sought to sever the connection between the old world and the new. The metric of success was tonnage. If the U-boats could sink ships faster than the Allied shipyards could weld them, Britain would starve. The battlefield was defined by reach. In the coastal waters near North America and the approaches to the United Kingdom, the convoys enjoyed the protection of land-based aircraft. A circling B-24 Liberator or a Sunderland flying boat was enough to force a U-boat to submerge, robbing it of its speed and its ability to coordinate with the Wolfpack. In these zones, the odds were manageable, but in the center of the ocean, there existed a blind spot. It was a corridor of water roughly 300 miles wide, known to the strategists as the Mid-Atlantic Gap. To the sailors who traversed it, it was known as the Black Pit. Here, the fuel gauges of Allied patrol planes ran low, forcing them to turn back. Here, the convoys were alone. The psychological weight of the gap was immense. For the merchant crews, entering this zone meant crossing a threshold into total vulnerability. The ocean here was deeper, the swells higher, and the silence more profound. They knew that beneath the surface, the U-boats were waiting, often surfacing at night to attack on the surface like torpedo boats, their diesel engines clamoring in the dark before the first explosion tore through a tanker's hull. In the Black Pit, a ship struck by a torpedo was often a death sentence for the entire crew. The water temperature was lethal within minutes. Rescue vessels, if they existed, could rarely stop without becoming targets themselves. The men of the merchant navy did not speak of glory. They spoke of the cold, the oil, and the terrible duration of the crossing. The British Admiralty looked at the map and saw a problem of geometry and resources. To close the gap, they needed aircraft carriers, mobile airfields that could travel with the convoys and provide a continuous umbrella of air cover. But in 1942, a conventional aircraft carrier was among the most complex and resource-intensive machines on Earth. There was a critical shortage of steel. Every plate of armor and every girder was already allocated to tanks, battleships, and landing craft. There was a shortage of aluminum for airframes. There was a shortage of skilled labor to lay the keels. The shipyards of the Clyde and the Tyne were operating at maximum capacity, yet they could not replace the losses, let alone build a new fleet of escort carriers fast enough to stem the bleeding in the Atlantic. Winston Churchill, a man prone to bouts of deep melancholy regarding the naval war, famously wrote that the only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril. The fear was rational. The mathematics of tonnage were turning against the Allies. If the gap could not be closed by steel, it had to be closed by something else. The desperation of the moment stripped away the luxury of conventional thinking. The Admiralty needed a landing strip in the middle of the ocean, one that required no steel, could not be sunk by torpedoes, and could be built from materials that were virtually infinite. They needed an island where no island existed. It was in this climate of exhausted resources and existential dread that the impossible began to look like a necessity. The solution would not come from a naval architect, but from the fringes of scientific theory, born of the cold itself. The architect of the impossible in the rigid hierarchy of the British military, where rank was denoted by gold braid and tradition was guarded like scripture, Geoffrey Pyke was an anomaly. He was not a soldier. He wore no uniform. He was a man of disheveled suits and unkempt hair, a journalist and educator by trade, who moved through the corridors of Combined Operations Headquarters with the distracted air of a man solving a puzzle only he could see. Yet Lord Louis Mountbatten, the chief of Combined Operations, kept him close. Mountbatten understood that the war had moved beyond the capabilities of the parade ground. It required the weaponization of the eccentric. Pyke operated from a fundamental belief that the scarcity of resources was an illusion caused by a lack of imagination. While the Admiralty agonized over the shortage of steel and aluminum, Pyke looked to the natural world. He saw the ice that choked the North Atlantic not as a hazard, but as raw material. The concept began with a simple, albeit staggering, proposition. If steel was too precious to float, why not build a carrier out of ice? It was buoyant, abundant, and free. But natural ice had fatal flaws. It was brittle, prone to shattering under the shock of an explosion, and liable to melt in the warmer currents of the mid-Atlantic. A ship made of pure ice would be a tomb. Pyke, however, was not easily deterred by the laws of physics. He merely sought to bend them. He turned to a team of scientists, including the Austrian molecular biologist Max Pykrete, who was then technically an enemy alien interned in Britain, but released for his expertise. In a secret cold storage locker beneath Smithfield Meat Market in London, they began to experiment. The breakthrough came with the addition of wood pulp. By mixing roughly 14% sawdust with 86% water, the mixture did not freeze into the brittle crystal lattice of ordinary ice. Instead, the wood fibers acted as a microscopic reinforcement, similar to the steel rods in reinforced concrete. The resulting material was dull, opaque, and unyielding. They named it Pykrete. The properties of Pykrete were startling. It was as hard as concrete, but lighter. It could be machined like wood, cut on a lathe, and planed smooth. Crucially, it did not shatter. When struck by a bullet or a hammer, the energy was absorbed and dissipated by the matted fibers. Furthermore, the wood pulp formed an insulating shell as the surface thawed, drastically slowing the melting process. A block of Pykrete could survive in boiling water for hours with only minimal loss of mass. Pyke drafted his proposal in a sprawling, densely written memo that would have been discarded by a lesser commander. He quoted the book of Habakkuk from the Old Testament, "Behold thee among the heathen, and regard and wonder marvelously, for I will work a work in your days, which you will not believe, though it be told you." The project was christened Habakkuk. Though the spelling was frequently corrupted in the official files, the specifications Pyke proposed were Leviathan. He envisioned a vessel 2,000 feet long, 4 times the length of the RM's Queen Mary, with a hull 40 feet thick. It would displace over 2 million tons. It would carry hundreds of aircraft and possess an internal refrigeration system to keep its own hull frozen. It was to be a floating island, immune to torpedoes, capable of crushing U-boats through sheer persistence. To the naval architects of the Admiralty, the idea was an affront to centuries of shipbuilding. It was monstrous, unprecedented, and seemingly insane. But to Mountbatten, and eventually to Winston Churchill, it represented something else. It was a refusal to accept the limitations of the material world. In the dark, freezing laboratory under the meat market, the impossible had been rendered into a physical block of gray matter. The question was no longer whether it could be built, but whether the Allied leadership had the will to believe in it. The Quebec demonstration by August 1943, the war had entered a phase of grim, industrial momentum. The Allies were no longer merely surviving. They were planning the liberation of Europe. In the grand suites of the Chateau Frontenac in Quebec City, the First Quebec Conference, codenamed Quadrant, brought together the architects of the Allied strategy. Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt, along with their combined chiefs of staff, gathered to debate the invasion of France, the strategic bombing campaign, and the atomic secrets of the Manhattan Project. Into this atmosphere of high stakes and cigar smoke walked Lord Louis Mountbatten. He carried with him not a map or a dossier, but a block of ice. Mountbatten understood that the project's scale was its greatest liability. To a room full of admirals and generals accustomed to the realities of steel and oil, a 2-million-ton ice ship sounded like the delusion of a fevered mind. The Habakkuk concept had been floating through the lower levels of the bureaucracy, gathering skepticism and derision in equal measure. To secure the immense resources required, resources that would be diverted from conventional warships and bombers, Mountbatten knew he could not rely on paper specifications alone. He needed a demonstration of physical reality. The scene that unfolded in the conference room remains one of the most surreal episodes of the Second World War. Mountbatten had ordered 2 heavy blocks of material to be wheeled into the meeting. The first was a block of pure, frozen water. The second was a block of Pykrete. He invited the strongest man present to take a sledgehammer to the ice. The blow fell, and the ice shattered, splinters flying across the polished floor. It was exactly as the skeptics expected: brittle, fragile, temporary. Then, the hammer was brought down on the Pykrete. The tool bounced off the gray surface with a dull thud, leaving the block intact and the wielder's arm stinging from the recoil. The wood pulp had done its work, binding the ice into a substance that behaved more like granite than water. But Mountbatten was not finished. He understood that the threat to an aircraft carrier did not come from hammers, but from high-velocity ballistics. He drew his service revolver in the confined space of the conference room. Surrounded by the men responsible for the lives of millions, the chief of combined operations leveled his weapon at the block of ordinary ice and fired. The ice disintegrated. He then turned his aim to the block of Pykrete. The report of the gun was deafening. But instead of embedding itself in the material or shattering the block, the bullet ricocheted. It shrieked off the frozen surface, whistling past the leg of Admiral Ernest King, the commander-in-chief of the United States fleet, and embedding itself in the wall. The room fell silent. The violence of the demonstration had stripped away the theoretical absurdity. The bullet had failed to penetrate. If a block of Pykrete could repel a .38 caliber round at point-blank range, a hull 40 feet thick could theoretically shrug off a torpedo warhead. The gathered chiefs of staff, men who dealt in the hard currency of armor penetration and explosive yields, were forced to confront a new reality. Churchill, always susceptible to the allure of the unorthodox and the grand, was captivated. He saw in Habakkuk the potential for a strategic masterstroke, a floating airfield that could dominate the Atlantic and perhaps even serve as a staging ground for the invasion of Japan. The skepticism of the Americans, particularly the pragmatist Admiral King, began to erode in the face of the physical evidence. The mad project was no longer an experiment. It was given the highest priority. The directive was issued to move from the laboratory to the field. A prototype was to be built, not in a freezer in London, but in the unforgiving winter of the Canadian Rockies. The demonstration at Quebec had succeeded. Mountbatten had sold the impossible to the world's most powerful leaders, proving that in a total war, even ice could be forged into a weapon. The secret on Lake Patricia, far from the gray swells of the Atlantic, and thousands of miles from the bombed-out streets of London, the war found a quiet, frozen corner in the Canadian Rockies. In early 1943, a strange convoy of trucks wound its way into Jasper National Park, Alberta. They arrived at Lake Patricia, a body of water locked in the grip of the northern winter. Surrounded by a silence so profound, it felt like a different planet from the battlefields of Europe. Here, the theoretical violence of the Quebec Conference was translated into physical labor. The site was chosen for its isolation and its temperature. If an ice ship were to be built, it required a cradle of cold. But the workforce chosen to build this instrument of war provided one of the conflict's deepest ironies. They were not naval engineers or soldiers. Many were conscientious objectors, Mennonites, Doukhobors, and pacifists who had refused to carry a rifle on moral or religious grounds. Under the alternative service protocols, they were conscripted for labor, sent into the wilderness to serve the nation without taking life. They were not told what they were building. To the men sawing blocks of ice from the frozen lake surface, the structure looked like a boathouse or perhaps a bizarre-roofed barge. The secrecy was absolute. The project was compartmentalized to such a degree that the men laying the refrigeration pipes, the veins that would keep the ship alive, had no concept of the vessel's intended destination. They labored under the assumption that they were building a storage depot, or perhaps a new type of ice-strengthened pier. The conditions were brutal. The temperature at Lake Patricia frequently dropped to 20 degrees below zero. In this stinging cold, the properties of Pykrete became a daily reality for the workers. They mixed the wood pulp and water in great slurry tanks, pouring it into molds where it hardened into a material that defied their understanding of ice. It did not crack. It thudded. It could be planed like timber. It felt dead and heavy, lacking the crystalline sparkle of natural ice. The prototype was a scale model, though model is a deceptive term. It was 60 feet long and weighed 1,000 tons. Its walls were hollowed out and laced with a complex network of ducts and pipes, through which cold air was circulated by a 1-horsepower engine. This was the heart of the Habakkuk concept, an active refrigeration system that would prevent the ship from melting, even if it sailed through the equator. For the men on the lake, the work was a surreal monochromatic existence. They lived in a world of white snow, black pine, and the gray sludge of Pykrete. There was a monastic quality to the labor. These were men who had rejected the chaos of war, yet here they were, freezing their hands to construct a vessel designed to launch bombers. The psychological strain was not one of combat trauma, but of cognitive dissonance, the quiet burden of contributing to a machine whose purpose was hidden. In a landscape that was indifferent to human struggle. As spring approached, the true test began. The lake ice around the prototype began to thaw and break apart, turning the solid surface back into water. But the prototype remained. As the sun grew stronger, the boat did not dissolve. The active refrigeration hummed, keeping the Pykrete structure at a stable temperature. It floated there, a gray, ugly slab in the pristine water, refusing to return to the liquid state. To the few officials who visited, the object on Lake Patricia was a triumph. It proved that a structure made of ice and wood pulp could support its own weight and remain frozen through a Canadian summer. But to the men who built it and then left it behind, it remained an enigma, a ghost ship built by pacifists, floating in a mountain lake, waiting for a crew that would never arrive. The construction proved the physics were sound, but it also highlighted the immense, crushing effort required to maintain the unnatural. The prototype had survived the winter, but it had yet to face the scrutiny of the accountants. The mathematics of survival. The prototype on Lake Patricia had proven a scientific principle, But war is not fought in a laboratory, nor is it fought on the placid waters of a mountain lake. As the data from the Canadian experiment migrated back to the Admiralty in London and the War Department in Washington, the romance of the unsinkable island began to collide with the cold rigidity of industrial mathematics. The dream of Habakkuk was defined by its scale. To serve its purpose as a floating airfield capable of launching heavy bombers, the vessel needed to be 2,000 feet long and 300 feet wide. It would displace over 2 million tons of water. This was not merely a ship. It was a man-made geological feature. But as naval architects began to draft the blueprints for the full-scale vessel, the free nature of the ice proved to be an illusion. The first problem was the material itself. While Pykrete was stronger than ice, it was not static. Like the glaciers from which the concept was born, ice under pressure exhibits a property known as plastic flow. It moves. Over time, a hull of such immense weight would begin to sag under its own mass, the structure warping and bowing as gravity acted upon the frozen fibers. To counteract this, the engineers realized they could not simply cast a block of Pykrete. They would need to reinforce it. Here lay the great irony of Project Habakkuk. The entire strategic rationale for the ship was to save steel. Yet, to keep the ice frozen, the vessel required a refrigeration plant of unprecedented size, a labyrinth of piping and compressors capable of circulating coolant through millions of cubic feet of hull. To keep the Pykrete from sagging, it required internal girders. To insulate the hull from the Atlantic summer, it needed a skin of cork and timber. When the accountants ran the numbers, the paradox was revealed. The ice ship would require nearly as much steel for its refrigeration and reinforcement as a conventional aircraft carrier. Furthermore, the insulation required to stop the ship from melting in the mid-Atlantic would consume enough cork to bottle every vintage of wine in Europe for a century. The resource that was supposed to be infinite ice was demanding resources that were critically finite. Then there was the issue of propulsion. A 2-million-ton block of ice has the hydrodynamic properties of a brick. The Admiralty required the vessel to move, to keep pace with convoys, and to steer into the wind for flight operations. But the drag of such a hull was immense. The calculated power required to push Habakkuk through the water at a mere 7 knots was staggering. It would require a power plant equivalent to that of several battleships combined. And even with that power, the vessel would be agonizingly slow, a drifting leviathan that could not outmaneuver a storm. Let alone a tactical threat, the engineers also faced the parasitic load. A significant portion of the ship's power generation would be consumed not by propulsion, but by survival. The engines would have to run constantly just to keep the ship from dissolving. If the refrigeration failed due to mechanical breakdown or battle damage, the carrier would not sink in the traditional sense. It would slowly, humiliatingly return to the ocean. The psychological friction within the project intensified. On one side stood the visionaries like Pyke and Mountbatten, driven by the desperation of the U-boat war and the belief that ingenuity could overcome physics. On the other side stood the naval constructors, the men of the Royal Corps of Naval Constructors, who viewed ships as machines of balance and efficiency. To them, Habakkuk was a nightmare of diminishing returns. They argued that for the cost and labor of building one Habakkuk, the Allies could build conventional airfields in the Azores, or produce fleets of escort carriers. By late 1943, the mathematics of survival had shifted. The question was no longer, can we build it? The prototype had answered that. Yes, with enough effort, it was possible. The new question was far more damning. Is it worth the cost? The ice ship was becoming a parasite of its own, threatening to consume the very industrial capacity it was designed to save. The enemy was no longer the U-boat. It was the sheer, unyielding inefficiency of trying to keep winter alive in the middle of the ocean. The thaw of ambition in the end Project Habakkuk was not destroyed by a German torpedo or a structural failure. It was dismantled by the very thing it sought to conquer, the relentless speed of the war itself. By late 1943, the strategic landscape of the Atlantic had shifted fundamentally. The desperation that had birthed the idea of an ice carrier, the terrified realization that Britain was losing the tonnage war, had begun to recede. Replaced by the crushing weight of Allied industrial superiority, the mid-Atlantic gap, that terrifying void where U-boats hunted with impunity, was being erased. It was not closed by a floating island of Pykrete, but by two developments that were far less fantastic, yet devastatingly effective. The first was the arrival of the Very Long-Range VLR B-24 Liberator. Modified with extra fuel tanks and improved radar, these aircraft could now patrol the entirety of the convoy routes. The Black Pit was illuminated by the sweep of Allied radar. The U-boats, forced to submerge by the constant presence of air cover, lost their mobility and their lethality. The second development was diplomatic. In October 1943, the British government secured the use of air bases in the Azores from Portugal. This archipelago, sitting strategically in the central Atlantic, provided a stationary, unsinkable aircraft carrier made of volcanic rock and earth. The need to build an artificial island evaporated the moment. A real island became available. With the gap closed by land-based air power and the proliferation of conventional steel escort carriers mass-produced in American shipyards at a rate that staggered the imagination, rationale for Habakkuk collapsed. The project had been a solution to a shortage of steel and aluminum. But by 1944, the Allied economies were producing steel and aluminum in quantities that made scarcity a memory. The United States was launching a new escort carrier every week. The difficult, dangerous, and experimental science of Pykrete was no longer a necessity. It was a curiosity. The cancellation was quiet. There was no grand announcement, no public acknowledgement of the millions of dollars and man-hours sunk into the ice. In December 1943, the Habakkuk board met for the final time. The projected costs had ballooned. The technical challenges of the refrigeration system remained daunting, and the strategic need had vanished. The order was given to cease all work. For Geoffrey Pike, the architect of the impossible, the decision was a bitter defeat. His vision of a fleet of white giants crushing the Axis powers was filed away in the archives of the Admiralty, labeled as a feasibility study rather than a war-winning weapon. The war moved on, turning its eyes toward the beaches of Normandy and the island-hopping campaigns of the Pacific, leaving the science of ice behind. Back in the Canadian Rockies, on Lake Patricia, the prototype met a lonely end. The machinery was stripped out, the engines, the pipes, the valuable metal recovered for the war effort. The wooden roof was removed. What remained was the hull of Pykrete, 1,000 tons of wood pulp and frozen water, floating in the summer silence. It did not melt quickly. The insulation properties of the wood pulp, which had so impressed the generals at Quebec, now worked to preserve the ghost ship. It drifted in the lake through the spring and into the summer of 1944, a stubborn, gray monolith refusing to acknowledge that it had been abandoned. Locals recall seeing it, a strange decaying shape on the water, slowly sloughing off layers of gray slush. Finally, the physics of the thaw won out. The structure lost its buoyancy, the water reclaimed the ice, and the wood pulp sank to the muddy bottom of the lake. It was an unceremonious burial for a vessel that was meant to change the course of history. The great ambition of the Admiralty, the dream of conquering the ocean with the cold itself, dissolved into the dark water, leaving nothing but a pile of underwater debris and a story that few would believe. The ice had not failed. The world had simply moved too fast for it to hold its shape. A monument to ingenuity, today, Lake Patricia lies quiet in the shadow of Pyramid Mountain. It is a place of stillness, visited by hikers and tourists who come to witness the pristine beauty of the Canadian Rockies. The water is clear and cold, reflecting the pines and the sky with the indifference of nature. But beneath the surface, resting in the silt and the darkness, lies the physical memory of a desperate time. In the 1980s, divers exploring the lake bottom discovered the remains of the prototype. They found a massive mound of asphalt, wood pulp, and metal, the skeletal debris of the boat that refused to melt. A plaque was eventually placed underwater, a silent marker for Project Habakkuk. It is a strange memorial, hidden from view, commemorating a ship that never sailed and a fleet that never existed. It is easy, from the safety of the present, to look back on Project Habakkuk as a folly. In the clean light of hindsight, the idea of a 2-million-ton aircraft carrier made of ice and sawdust appears absurd, a chapter of wartime eccentricity that borders on the comical. But to dismiss Habakkuk as a failure of logic is to misunderstand the psychological reality of 1942. This project was not born of madness. It was born of irrational terror. It was conceived at a moment when the civilized world stood on the precipice of starvation, when the German U-boats were systematically severing the arteries of the Allied war effort. The men who authorized the expenditure of millions of dollars and thousands of man-hours were not dreamers. They were pragmatists who had looked at the inventory of steel and found it wanting. They were leaders who understood that, if the Atlantic lifeline was cut, the war was over. Habakkuk stands as a testament to the extremes of total war. It reveals a specific moment in human history when the fear of defeat was so absolute that it stripped away the boundaries of the possible. Conventional thinking had failed to close the mid-Atlantic gap, so the Allies turned to the unconventional. They were willing to weaponize the cold, to rewrite the laws of naval architecture, and to trust in the vision of outsiders like Geoffrey Pike because the alternative was unthinkable. The legacy of the project is also a reflection on the cost of such ingenuity. Geoffrey Pike, the disheveled genius who saw aircraft carriers in the ice floes, did not find peace in the victory he helped to engineer. He was a man whose mind operated at a velocity that the peacetime world could not accommodate. In 1948, just 3 years after the war ended, Pike took his own life. He was a casualty of the same intense, burning intellect that had birthed Pykrete, a mind that could solve impossible problems but could not find rest in the quiet that followed. Project Habakkuk remains one of the great what-ifs of the Second World War. Had the Azores not opened, had the long-range liberators not arrived, the invasion of Europe might well have been launched from islands of ice. The physics were sound. The material was resilient. The prototype proved that the impossible could be built. Ultimately, the ice ship serves as a monument to the scale of the conflict. World War II was a furnace that consumed resources, lives, and ideas with equal veracity. It accelerated technology, pushing humanity from biplanes to jet engines, from chemical explosives to atomic energy, and briefly from steel to ice. Habakkuk reminds us that in the face of existential threat, human ingenuity knows no limits. It is a reminder that when survival is at stake, we will try to conquer the elements themselves, building fortresses out of the very water that threatens to drown us. The ice has long since melted, returning to the water cycle of the planet. The steel of the Atlantic convoys has largely rusted away. But the story of the iceberg aircraft carrier remains a frozen snapshot of a world pushed to its absolute limit, suspended forever in the cold, deep waters of history.